The courtroom was filled with laughter. Judge Raymond Carter leaned back in his grand leather chair, shaking his head with amusement. "This is ridiculous," he said, smirking as he looked down at the elderly woman standing before him. She was dressed in a simple beige suit, her silver hair tied in a neat bun. Her hands, veined and wrinkled, rested on the wooden table in front of her. "Ma'am," Judge Carter said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "are you lost? This is a court of law, not a knitting club. Did you wander in here looking for your grandkids?" The laughter in the courtroom grew louder. Some of the younger lawyers exchanged smirks. The bailiff even had to clear his throat to stop himself from chuckling. But the elderly woman didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply stood there, calm and composed, her eyes sharp and unshaken, staring straight at the judge. But before that, like and subscribe to the channel, it helps a lot, and get back to the video. Judge Carter scoffed. "You actually think you can defend yourself in this case? An old lady like you? I mean, do you even know how to argue in a courtroom?" And then something changed. The woman took a deep breath, slowly, deliberately. She adjusted the lapels of her jacket. Then, in a voice that was steady and firm, she said, "Your Honor, I strongly advise you to choose your words carefully." The entire room fell silent. A nervous whisper rippled through the gallery. Even the cocky young attorneys in the front row shifted in their seats, sensing something unusual. Judge Carter chuckled, though it sounded more forced now. "Oh, and why is that?" The elderly woman leaned forward slightly. "Because I've won more cases than you have ever presided over, Judge Carter," she said coolly, "and you just made a very big mistake." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Someone dropped a pin. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Judge Carter's smirk faded. Who was this woman? 2 days earlier, the sun was shining brightly over New York City. People rushed up and down the sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, checking their phones, lost in their own worlds. At a small cafe on Fifth Avenue, Eleanor Lawson stirred a packet of sugar into her tea. She wasn't in a rush. She never was. Life had taught her that moving fast didn't always mean getting ahead. As she took a sip, she overheard 2 young lawyers sitting at the table beside her. "I'm telling you, this case is a guaranteed win," one of them said, grinning. "That old lady doesn't stand a chance. It's open and shut." Eleanor's eyebrows lifted slightly. She continued sipping her tea. "Judge Carter is going to tear her apart." The other young lawyer laughed. "He's ruthless. You saw how he treated that nervous law student last month. What do you think he's going to do to some retired grandmother?" Eleanor calmly set her teacup down. She had heard enough. Standing up, she adjusted her blazer and walked out of the cafe, her heels clicking against the pavement. She wasn't just some retired grandmother. She was Eleanor Lawson, and she had a case to win. Over the next several hours, Eleanor sat at her old wooden desk in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Her eyes scanned every detail. Her hands moved methodically, highlighting important sections. She was preparing for battle. Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled outside her window, she received a phone call. "Ma'am, I hope you know what you're doing," a voice said hesitantly. It was her assistant, Daniel, young, fresh out of law school, and full of nerves. "Judge Carter doesn't respect anyone, especially not someone like you." Eleanor smiled. "Like me?" she asked. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "I mean someone experienced. He's going to underestimate you." "Everyone is." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what I want." The next morning, she walked into the courthouse, her back straight, her chin high. Every step she took was measured and deliberate. People whispered. Lawyers glanced at her with amusement. The bailiff looked confused when she approached. "Ma'am, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked. Eleanor handed him a neatly folded document. "I believe I am," she said with a small smile. Moments later, the courtroom doors opened, and she stepped inside, and that was when it all began. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, smirking. The courtroom burst into laughter. "Are you lost?" was a foolish mistake, one he was about to regret. A thick silence swallowed the courtroom. Judge Carter's confident smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered, straightening his posture. His pride wouldn't allow him to be intimidated by an elderly woman, no matter how fierce she looked. "Excuse me," he said, feigning amusement. "Did you just suggest I made a mistake?" Eleanor clasped her hands in front of her, calm as ever. "I didn't suggest it, Your Honor. I stated it as a fact." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Thomas Bennett, looked intrigued. Judge Carter let out a dry chuckle, but there was an edge to his tone now. "And what, pray tell, is this so-called big mistake I've made?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether he was even worth her time. Then, with careful precision, she said, "Underestimating me." The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Eleanor casually turned away and began organizing her files. It was a power move, one that said, "You are not worth my time." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time in years, Judge Carter felt something unusual, doubt. 2 weeks earlier, Eleanor was standing in front of her old bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of her legal texts. It had been years since she last stepped into a courtroom, decades even. But when the notice arrived, a lawsuit filed against her for something she hadn't done. She knew she had no choice. A younger woman might have panicked, a weaker woman might have given up, but Eleanor, she simply poured herself a cup of tea and got to work. The case was absurd, a blatant attempt to bully her into submission. A corporation was trying to take away her small property, claiming she had violated a zoning law. It was nothing but greed. They assumed she would fold under the pressure. They assumed wrong. Daniel had begged her to let someone else handle it. "There are plenty of lawyers who can take this on for you," he'd said over the phone. Eleanor had smiled. "Yes," she had replied, "but none of them are me." Back in the courtroom, Judge Carter forced a chuckle. "All right, Miss Lawson, is it?" Eleanor gave him a slow nod. Judge Carter glanced at his notes. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes." "Are you aware of the charges against you?" "I am." His smirk returned. "Then I assume you're also aware that the law is not something you can just walk into and expect to win." Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "And I assume you're aware that making assumptions in a courtroom is a dangerous thing." A hushed woe rippled through the audience. The young lawyers in the front row exchanged wide-eyed glances. Judge Carter's jaw tightened. He turned to the opposing counsel. "Mr. Bennett, let's begin." Bennett stood, buttoning his expensive navy blue suit. "Of course, Your Honor." He picked up a thick file and walked toward the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a simple case," he began, his voice confident and smooth. "Miss Lawson is in clear violation of city zoning laws." "Objection," Eleanor said suddenly, not even looking up from her papers. Bennett faltered. "Excuse me?" Judge Carter narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" Eleanor finally raised her gaze, her expression unreadable. "On the grounds that Mr. Bennett just made a false statement." Bennett scoffed. "False? Miss Lawson, the documents clearly show." "The documents show what you want them to show," Eleanor interrupted, "but I'm afraid you miscalculated." Judge Carter leaned forward, his patience thinning. "Miss Lawson, you'd better have a solid reason for interrupting the prosecution." Eleanor nodded once. Then, with practiced ease, She lifted a single sheet of paper and held it up. I do. Silence fell. Judge Carter's eyes flickered to the document in her hand. The courtroom waited. Then Eleanor calmly said, "And with this, I can prove that everything Mr. Bennett just stated is completely false." Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. Judge Carter's face paled. Bennett stiffened. Eleanor simply smiled. Checkmate. The entire courtroom was frozen. Judge Carter's gaze locked onto the paper in Eleanor's hand, his fingers tightening on his gavel. Even the most confident lawyer in the room looked uneasy. Bennett, the prosecution, took a slow step forward. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Eleanor glanced at him, unimpressed. "Then by all means, Mr. Bennett," she said, holding the paper higher, "come and take a closer look." The silence stretched as Bennett hesitated. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do. Finally, Judge Carter cleared his throat. His pride wouldn't let an elderly woman take control of his courtroom. "Miss Lawson," he said, voice tight, approached the bench. Eleanor didn't rush. She moved slowly, deliberately. She had done this walk countless times before, except back then, no one had dared to underestimate her. She placed the document in front of Judge Carter, then stepped back, watching him closely. The judge adjusted his glasses and skimmed the paper. His face changed instantly. His smugness disappeared, his smirk dropped. His lips parted slightly as he scanned the contents of the document again, as if he had misread it the first time. Bennett, still standing awkwardly in the middle of the courtroom, finally broke the silence. "Your Honor," he said, shifting nervously. "What does it say?" Judge Carter exhaled sharply and sat back in his chair. He tapped the paper once with his finger before slowly turning his eyes toward Eleanor. You had this all along?" Eleanor gave a small smile. "Of course." Judge Carter blinked, opened his mouth, then closed it. Bennett, growing impatient, rushed forward to grab the document. The moment his eyes scanned the page, his confidence shattered. His face drained of color, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly it almost crumpled. "No," he muttered under his breath. "This can't be right." Eleanor's smile widened just slightly. "I assure you, Mr. Bennett, it's very much right." 1 month earlier, the sun had barely risen when Eleanor arrived at the city records office. It had been years since she had set foot in a place like this, but some habits never faded. She moved with purpose, her keen eyes scanning the shelves. A younger woman behind the counter looked up, confused. Ma'am, can I help you?" Eleanor set her leather briefcase on the desk and gave a polite nod. "I need access to zoning records for 5th Avenue, Lot 374. The woman frowned. "That information is sealed. Only attorneys or government officials can request it." Eleanor smiled and slowly reached into her briefcase. A second later, she slid a small black card across the counter. The woman picked it up, glanced at it, then froze. Her mouth fell open. "This is impossible," she whispered. Eleanor simply waited. The woman swallowed and stood abruptly. I'll get the files right away, ma'am." She disappeared into the back, leaving Eleanor alone. Eleanor took a deep breath and looked around the room. She could already see it. The case unfolding, the arguments being made, the moment everything would come crashing down on those who underestimated her. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about proving a point. Back in the courtroom, Judge Carter slowly removed his glasses. "Miss Lawson," he said carefully, "would you like to explain this?" Eleanor turned to face the jury, her voice as steady as ever. "This document proves that my property has been exempt from zoning laws for over 30 years. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Bennett's lips parted. But how?" Eleanor looked at him as if he were a child struggling with basic arithmetic. Because I wrote the exemption myself, she said simply. Dead silence. Bennett stumbled back a step. Judge Carter blinked rapidly, looking back at the paper in disbelief. The entire courtroom was in chaos. People whispered furiously, others gasped, and the stenographer had to pause her typing just to process what had been said. Judge Carter banged his gavel. Order. The room slowly quieted. He turned back to Eleanor. You expect me to believe that you... He gestured toward her as if struggling to comprehend. Personally wrote this exemption decades ago? Eleanor met his gaze without blinking. Yes, Your Honor, because at the time, I was the city's chief zoning attorney. The courtroom exploded. People jumped from their seats. Lawyers turned to each other in disbelief. Bennett looked like he might actually faint, and Judge Carter, for the first time in his entire career, had no words. The courtroom was in an uproar. Gasps and whispers flooded the air as people tried to process what they had just heard. Even the young attorneys sitting in the front row, who had been smirking earlier, now looked stunned. Judge Carter's gavel slammed down. Order, I said. Order. Slowly, the murmurs died down, but the tension in the room remained thick. Judge Carter turned to Eleanor, his fingers tightening around the wooden gavel. Miss Lawson, are you telling this court that you personally wrote the zoning exemption for your own property? Eleanor gave a slight nod. Not just my property, she corrected, her voice calm. I wrote exemptions for several properties when I was serving as the city's chief zoning attorney. This was over 3 decades ago, back when the city was still developing its modern zoning laws. Judge Carter looked down at the document again, his forehead creased with disbelief. If this is true, why wasn't this presented before? Eleanor clasped her hands behind her back. Because no one bothered to look. Another wave of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Bennett's face was turning red, not out of anger but embarrassment. He had walked into this trial believing he was about to crush an old woman. Instead, he was being humiliated in front of everyone. Judge Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This is highly irregular. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. What's irregular, Your Honor? That an elderly woman knows the law better than you. A collective oof came from the gallery. Even the stenographer suppressed a smirk. Judge Carter's eyes darkened. Watch yourself, Miss Lawson. But Eleanor didn't flinch. With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been watching myself for over 60 years, and I've done just fine. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Carter's grip on his gavel tightened. He was losing control of the courtroom, and he knew it. Bennett suddenly stepped forward, desperate to regain the upper hand. Your Honor, even if this exemption is real, we can't just take her word for it. We need to verify its authenticity. Eleanor gave a small shrug. By all means, verify it. But while you do, I'd also suggest pulling my employment records. She turned slightly, addressing the jury. Now, because when you do, you'll find that I wasn't just any attorney. She let that sentence linger for a moment before adding, I was the youngest chief zoning attorney in this city's history. More gasps, more murmurs. Judge Carter's expression darkened. He wasn't just being humiliated. His entire authority was crumbling in real time. Bennett swallowed hard. This doesn't change the fact that the laws may have changed since then. Eleanor smiled. They have, but my exemption was grandfathered in, which means it still stands. Bennett had no response. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but nothing came out. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. He knew she was right. The law was clear, and if what she was saying was true, then there was no case against her. He turned to Bennett. Do you have any further arguments? Bennett's face burned with frustration, but he shook his head. Not at this time, Your Honor. Eleanor simply smiled. But just as the courtroom began to settle, something unexpected happened. The side doors burst open, and a man in a dark suit rushed inside, his expression grim, his movements urgent. He whispered something to the bailiff, who immediately walked over to Judge Carter. The judge leaned forward as the bailiff whispered in his ear. The change in his expression was instant. His face turned pale, his grip on his gavel loosened, and then slowly, he turned back to Eleanor. His eyes wide with something no one had ever seen before, fear. The courtroom held its breath. What had just happened, and why did it seem like, for the first time ever, Judge Carter was afraid? The entire courtroom held its breath, with Judge Carter, the man known for his sharp tongue and unshakable authority, suddenly looking rattled. His grip on the gavel had loosened, his confident smirk had disappeared, and for the first time in his long career, he seemed genuinely unsure of what to do next. The man in the dark suit, clearly someone important, stood silently near the doorway, watching the judge expectantly. Eleanor remained still, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She had been in enough courtrooms to know when something wasn't right. Judge Carter cleared his throat and adjusted his robe. "We are going to take a brief recess." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Recess in the middle of a case wasn't normal. Bennett frowned. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "Why?" The look Judge Carter gave him shut him up immediately. "This court is in recess," the judge repeated, his voice strained. He banged his gavel harder than necessary. 15 minutes. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people stood, some stretching, others exchanging puzzled glances. Eleanor, however, didn't move. She simply watched. Judge Carter leaned toward the bailiff and muttered something under his breath before standing and stepping down from his bench. Without another word, he followed the man in the dark suit through a side door. Bennett shot Eleanor a suspicious look before rushing after them. Eleanor allowed herself a small smirk. Something had rattled them. Daniel, her young assistant, hurried to her side. "Miss Lawson, what's going on?" he whispered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she adjusted her jacket and finally said, "They just found something. Something they weren't prepared for." Daniel swallowed. "Do you think it's about you?" Eleanor turned her gaze toward the door Judge Carter had disappeared through. "Without a doubt," she murmured. 15 minutes earlier, inside Judge Carter's private chambers, tension filled the air. The man in the dark suit stood with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Judge Carter paced the room, his face pale. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" The man nodded. "We double-checked the records. She is exactly who she says she is." Judge Carter exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "I just made a complete fool of myself in there." Bennett, who had rushed in moments earlier, looked between them in confusion. "Excuse me, what's going on?" The man in the dark suit handed Bennett a file. "Read this." Bennett snatched the file and flipped it open. His eyes skimmed the pages. After a few seconds, his entire body stiffened. "This can't be real," he whispered. Judge Carter gave a humorless chuckle. "Oh, it's real." Bennett's hands tightened around the file. "How is this even possible? How did we not know?" The man in the suit sighed. "Because she disappeared from the public eye decades ago. After she retired, she erased herself from the legal world. No interviews, no articles, no public statements. She just vanished." Bennett swallowed hard. "But why?" Judge Carter shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" He exhaled sharply. "But right now we have a bigger problem." Bennett looked up. "Which is?" Judge Carter's face darkened. "I mocked her in open court." Bennett's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about losing a case anymore. They had disrespected her, and that was a mistake they would live to regret. Back in the courtroom, Eleanor sat patiently, her hands folded in her lap. She had been underestimated before, dismissed before, but what people failed to realize was that she never walked into a courtroom unprepared. And if Judge Carter and Bennett thought they could undo their mistakes with a 15-minute recess, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When the doors to the judge's chambers finally opened, everyone turned. Judge Carter re-entered the courtroom, but something was different. The arrogance was gone. The smirk was gone. Instead, he looked humbled. Bennett followed behind him, his face stiff with discomfort. Judge Carter sat down, adjusted his robe, and cleared his throat. "This court will now reconvene." Silence fell. He turned to Eleanor, and for the first time since the trial began, his voice was steady. "Miss Lawson," he said slowly, "before we proceed, I'd like to ask you a question." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Judge Carter hesitated. Then, with careful precision, he asked, "Why did you walk away from law all those years ago?" The entire courtroom went still. It was an unexpected question, a deeply personal one, and for the first time, Eleanor's expression changed just slightly. She exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the table. "That's not relevant to this case, Your Honor." Judge Carter leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Maybe not, but I'd still like to know." The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, she sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. And in a voice quieter than before, she said, "I walked away because I learned that justice doesn't always win." The words hit the courtroom like a punch. Even Judge Carter seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Bennett shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, sitting beside Eleanor, looked at her with quiet concern. But before anyone could ask her to elaborate, Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her sharpness returning. "But that was a long time ago," she continued, "and right now we have a case to finish, don't we?" Judge Carter studied her for a moment longer. Then slowly he nodded. Yes, we do." He turned to Bennett. "Does the prosecution have anything else to present?" Bennett looked as if he wanted to be anywhere but here, his face tense, his body stiff. But after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Judge Carter nodded again. Then he turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, given the evidence presented today, I see no reason to prolong this case any further." The entire courtroom tensed. The moment had arrived. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, took a breath, and said, "This court rules in favor of Miss Eleanor Lawson." A stunned silence followed, then applause, gasps, cheers. Eleanor, as always, remained composed. She simply let out a slow breath, her lips twitching in the faintest hint of a smile. Daniel, sitting beside her, grinned. "You did it," he whispered. Eleanor glanced at him. "Of course, I did," she murmured. "I never lose." Across the room, Judge Carter rubbed his temples. He had walked into this case thinking he was the most powerful person in the room. Now he knew better. As the courtroom erupted into noise, Bennett turned toward Eleanor, his face still stunned, and in a quiet voice, he asked, "Who are you?" Eleanor stood, gathering her things. She glanced at him with a knowing look. Then, in a voice filled with quiet amusement, she simply said, "Someone you should have done your research on." And with that, she walked out of the courtroom victorious. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Eleanor, sealing in the murmurs, whispers, and stunned silence she had left in her wake. Daniel hurried to keep up with her as she strode down the long marble hallway, her heels clicking with quiet confidence. "Miss Lawson," he panted, gripping his notepad tightly. "That was incredible. I mean, I knew you were good, but that was something else." Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "It was expected." Daniel blinked. "Expected?" Eleanor stopped walking. She turned to face him, her sharp eyes studying his eager, youthful expression. Daniel, let me tell you something, she said. The moment I walked into that courtroom, I already knew how this case would end. Daniel's brow furrowed. But how? You couldn't have predicted Judge Carter's reaction. You couldn't have known that man in the suit would interrupt. Eleanor gave a soft chuckle. Oh, I didn't predict their reactions. But I knew their type. She started walking again. Men like Judge Carter thrive on power. They love control, but their greatest weakness is they never consider the possibility that someone like me, a woman past her so-called prime, could outmatch them. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. So you let them underestimate you? Eleanor nodded, exactly. And when people underestimate you, they make mistakes. She reached the courthouse steps and paused, inhaling the crisp afternoon air. This wasn't just about winning a case, Daniel. It was about proving a point. Daniel hesitated. And did you prove it? Eleanor's lips twitched into a smirk. Oh, they'll be talking about this for years. But just as they stepped down onto the sidewalk, a voice called out from behind them, Miss Lawson. Eleanor turned. Judge Carter stood at the top of the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable. His robe had been removed, leaving him in a crisp white shirt and black slacks. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Judge Carter took a slow step forward. I owe you an apology. Daniel's eyebrows shot up. Eleanor remained impassive. Oh, Judge Carter sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I misjudged you. Badly. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. That's true. He let out a dry chuckle. You're not going to make this easy, are you? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Should I? Carter sighed again. He shoved his hands into his pockets. Look, I've spent my entire career believing I could read people the moment they walked into my courtroom. But today, I realized something. Eleanor waited, I realized. Carter continued, his voice quieter now, that I don't know half as much as I thought I did. The admission was unexpected. Daniel glanced at Eleanor, waiting to see her reaction. For a long moment, she simply studied Judge Carter. Then she took a step closer, her voice calm and even. Power doesn't come from a title, Your Honor. It comes from knowledge, from experience, and most of all, from respect. She paused. I suggest you start giving it to the right people. Judge Carter nodded slowly. I will. A beat of silence passed. Then Eleanor gave him the faintest of nods. Good. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Daniel hurried to catch up. Do you think he'll change? He asked quietly. Eleanor exhaled. Maybe. Daniel thought for a moment. Would you ever consider going back to practicing law? I mean, Eleanor gave a small, wistful smile. I don't need a courtroom to practice law. Daniel. She glanced up at the towering skyline of New York City. This city, she murmured, is one big courtroom. But just as they reached the curb, a black car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, and a familiar voice drifted out. Eleanor Lawson, still causing trouble. I see. Eleanor's smile vanished. Daniel frowned. Who is that? Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a slow breath and turned toward the car because sitting inside, watching her with an all-too-familiar smirk, was a face she hadn't seen in decades, a face she never thought she'd see again. And just like that, everything changed. Eleanor's pulse remained steady, but something in her chest tightened. The man in the car smirked, resting an elbow on the door, his dark eyes gleaming with the same cocky confidence they always had. Well, I wasn't sure you'd still be around after all these years. But here you are, still making headlines. Daniel glanced at Eleanor, then back at the man. Miss Lawson, who is this? Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer, peering into the car. James Calloway, her voice was quiet, measured. The smirk on the man's face deepened. Ah, so you do remember me? Daniel's eyebrows furrowed. James Calloway? Why does that name sound familiar? Calloway chuckled, his gaze never leaving Eleanor. That's because, kid, I used to be a very big deal. He turned back to Eleanor. And if I recall correctly, you were the one who ruined it for me. Daniel stiffened. Wait, you're James Calloway? As in the former district attorney. Calloway's grin widened. Bingo. Daniel's face paled. But you were disbarred. Calloway shrugged lazily. What can I say? Some people didn't like how I handled things. Isn't that right, Eleanor? Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. You weren't just disliked, Calloway. You were a fraud, a liar. You put innocent people behind bars and you profited off of it. Calloway sighed, feigning disappointment, always so dramatic. Daniel took a small step closer to Eleanor, lowering his voice. Miss Lawson, is this the man you walked away from law for? Calloway's smirk didn't falter. Eleanor didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Calloway exhaled and leaned back against his seat. I have to admit, watching you take down Carter today was fun, almost nostalgic. He tilted his head. You haven't lost your edge. Eleanor crossed her arms. What do you want, Calloway? His grin faded slightly. I want to talk. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. We have nothing to discuss. Oh, I think we do. He tapped a finger against the car door. Because, Eleanor, I'm back. Daniel stiffened. Back? What does that mean? Eleanor's lips pressed together. Calloway's eyes gleamed. It means, sweetheart, he said, turning to Daniel, that I'm not done with this city yet. A heavy silence settled between them. Eleanor inhaled slowly. You were disbarred, Calloway. You have no power anymore. Calloway's smile returned. But this time there was something dark behind it. That's what you think. Eleanor stared at him, unmoving. Then finally, Calloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He held it out to her. Consider this an invitation, he said. One I strongly suggest you accept. Eleanor didn't take it. Calloway chuckled, still stubborn. I see. He set the envelope on the passenger seat instead. I'll give you some time to think about it. But don't take too long, Eleanor. His smile sharpened. Because things are about to get interesting. The car window rolled up, and before Eleanor could say another word, the vehicle pulled away, vanishing into the crowded streets. Daniel turned to her, his face pale. Miss Lawson, what just happened? Eleanor stared at the spot where Calloway's car had disappeared. Her jaw clenched. War, she murmured. Daniel swallowed. What? She exhaled slowly, her eyes dark. James Calloway is back, she said quietly. And that means the city is in trouble. Daniel hesitated. But if he's disbarred, what can he even do? Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. You don't understand, Daniel. She looked back toward the city skyline where the sun was beginning to set. Calloway never needed the law to be dangerous. The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Daniel shifted nervously. So, what do we do? Eleanor exhaled. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, we stop him. The streets of New York City stretched out before Eleanor, the hum of car engines and distant chatter filling the air. But she wasn't hearing any of it. James Calloway was back, a name she had spent years trying to forget, a name she once thought had been erased from the legal world forever. Daniel walked beside her, clutching his notepad tightly. Miss Lawson, he said, glancing at her. What exactly did Calloway mean when he said things are about to get interesting? Eleanor exhaled slowly. It means he's planning something. And if I know Calloway, it's something dangerous. Daniel frowned. But what can he even do? He lost his law license. He has no power, Eleanor's jaw tightened. Calloway never needed a law license to be powerful. Daniel swallowed. What did he do exactly, back then? I mean, Eleanor stopped walking. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Calloway was one of the most ruthless district attorneys this city has ever seen. He didn't just win cases, he crushed people. He buried evidence, bribed witnesses, and strong-armed judges into ruling in his favor. And the worst part, her voice turned cold. He framed innocent people to boost his conviction rate. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's horrible. Eleanor nodded. It was. And for years, no one could touch him, until... She hesitated. Daniel leaned in. Until what? Eleanor's gaze darkened. Until I did. Daniel's eyes widened. You took him down? She nodded once. It took years of digging, of gathering proof. I had to go up against the entire system. Judges, politicians, corrupt cops. But in the end, I exposed him. I forced him into a corner where he had no way out. Daniel exhaled, and that's why he lost his license? Eleanor's lips pressed together. Yes. And I thought that was the end of it. She turned back toward the street, her thoughts racing. Calloway wasn't the type to return without a plan. He wasn't stupid. If he had resurfaced now, after all these years, it meant one thing. He was after something, and she needed to find out what. Just as she was about to speak, Daniel's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and frowned. That's weird. Eleanor glanced at him. What is it? Daniel's expression tightened. I just got a news alert. Judge Carter has been hospitalized. Eleanor stiffened. What? Daniel read quickly. It says he collapsed in his office an hour ago. Doctors are calling it stress-related. But... He hesitated. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. But you don't think that's the whole story? Daniel swallowed. It's just... Don't you think the timing is strange? Right after you win your case, right after Calloway shows up. Eleanor clenched her fists. Judge Carter was arrogant, overconfident, even rude, but he wasn't corrupt. And if he had suddenly fallen ill after Calloway's return, there was only one conclusion to draw. Calloway had already started his game. Eleanor inhaled sharply. We need to move fast. Daniel blinked. Move fast? How? She turned toward him, her expression steel. Calloway isn't just back to settle old grudges. Daniel. Her voice was firm. He's here to take back control of this city. Daniel's blood ran cold. Then what do we do? Eleanor looked up, her sharp gaze scanning the skyline. She knew what needed to be done. We do what we did last time. She exhaled. We take him down. The city lights flickered against the glass of Eleanor's apartment window, casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the night pressed down on her shoulders as she sat at her old wooden desk, sifting through decades of memories she had hoped to never revisit. A small pile of documents sat before her, clippings of past court cases, old witness testimonies, and the final report that had led to James Calloway's downfall. She ran a finger along the faded edges of a newspaper headline. Disgraced District Attorney James Calloway disbarred amid corruption scandal. Daniel sat across from her, his eyes scanning the documents with growing unease. Miss Lawson. This guy was worse than I thought. He picked up a report, bribery, intimidation, evidence tampering. It's a miracle he didn't end up in prison. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Oh, he almost did. But Calloway was too smart to leave loose ends. Every witness against him either disappeared or recanted their statements. Daniel frowned. Then how did you bring him down? Eleanor hesitated. Then quietly she said, I found the one witness he couldn't make disappear. Daniel sat forward. Who? Eleanor's eyes darkened. Me. Daniel's breath hitched. You? She nodded. I had worked with Calloway for years. I had seen his tactics up close. But what finally sealed his fate was the case of a man named Thomas Green. Daniel frowned. That name sounds familiar. Eleanor clenched her jaw. It should. He was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Daniel's face paled. Calloway framed him? Eleanor nodded. Green was an innocent man. Calloway needed a conviction to boost his reputation. So he planted evidence and manipulated the jury. And when I realized what had happened, I couldn't stay silent. Daniel leaned back, stunned. So you testified against him? Yes, and it cost me everything. A heavy silence fell between them. Daniel swallowed. Is that why you left law? Eleanor exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. When you take down a man like Calloway, you don't just ruin his career. You make enemies. Powerful ones. She tapped the desk. After the trial, my life became difficult. I was threatened, watched. I lost friends, colleagues. I realized that no matter how much I fought for justice, corruption would always find a way back. Daniel frowned. So you walked away? Eleanor nodded. I thought if I disappeared, Calloway's influence would disappear with me. Her jaw tightened. But I was wrong. Daniel sat in silence for a moment. Then carefully he asked, if you could go back, would you do it again? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Yes. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. You really are something else, Miss Lawson. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. So I've been told. Just then, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Daniel jumped. Are you expecting someone? Eleanor frowned. No. She stood and crossed the room, her movements careful. With a steady breath, she peered through the peephole. Her stomach dropped. Standing on the other side of the door, dressed in a sleek black suit, was a man she hadn't seen in years. Daniel noticed her stiffen. Who is it? Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. An old ghost. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. The man on the other side smiled. Hello, Eleanor. Her expression remained cold. Nathan Pierce. Daniel tensed. Who's Nathan Pierce? The man chuckled, stepping into the dimly lit room. I'm the man who used to clean up Calloway's messes. Daniel's breath hitched. You? Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. What do you want? Pierce sighed, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Come now, Eleanor. No small talk? No catching up? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Get to the point. Pierce smirked. Fine. Calloway sent me. Daniel's stomach twisted. Calloway? Pierce nodded. He wanted me to deliver a message. Eleanor crossed her arms. I don't take messages from criminals. Pierce chuckled. Oh, but this one's special. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. He says you should have stayed gone. A heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel swallowed hard. Is that a threat? Pierce shrugged. Call it a warning. He stepped back, his smirk never fading. You should know better than anyone, Eleanor. Calloway doesn't like unfinished business. Eleanor remained unfazed. Tell Calloway that if he wants to talk, he can do it himself. Pierce's smile widened. Oh, don't worry. You'll be seeing him soon enough. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving only the echo of his footsteps behind. Daniel let out a shaky breath. Miss Lawson, what do we do now? Eleanor turned her gaze hard as steel. We don't wait for Calloway to make the next move, she said. We make it first. The night air was crisp, wrapping around Eleanor and Daniel as they stepped onto the busy New York sidewalk. The city never slept, but tonight it felt different, heavier, charged with an invisible tension Eleanor knew all too well. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around him, his nervous energy obvious. Miss Lawson, are we really doing this? Going after Calloway before he makes a move? Eleanor's pace was steady, purposeful. We don't have a choice, Daniel. If we wait, He controls the game, and Calloway never plays fair. Daniel exhaled. Okay, so where do we start? Eleanor hailed a cab and slid inside, Daniel following close behind. As the driver pulled away from the curb, Eleanor spoke 2 words, Thomas Green. Daniel blinked. Wait, the guy Calloway framed? But isn't he still in prison? Eleanor nodded, her jaw tight. Yes, and that's exactly why we need to talk to him. 40 minutes later, they arrived at Rikers Island Prison. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the visitors' room as Eleanor and Daniel sat at a cold metal table, waiting. The door on the other side of the glass buzzed open, and a tall, tired-looking man in an orange jumpsuit stepped in. His hair had gone gray at the temples, his once strong frame now worn down by time and circumstance. Thomas Green. His eyes locked onto Eleanor the moment he saw her. A flicker of something passed through them. Recognition, curiosity, maybe even resentment. He took a seat across from them, picking up the phone on his side of the glass. Eleanor did the same. You got some nerve coming here, Lawson, he said, his voice rough from years of silence. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. I know. Thomas leaned forward slightly. What do you want? Eleanor's voice was steady. Calloway is back. Thomas stilled. His grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching. He's back, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Eleanor nodded. And I need to know what he's planning. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. You think I know, lady? I've been locked up for 30 years because of that man. He hasn't spoken my name since the day he had me put away. Daniel, sitting beside Eleanor, hesitated. But if Calloway was willing to ruin your life to protect himself back then, don't you think he'd still be keeping tabs on you now? Thomas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, I don't know what he's up to, but if he's back in the city, it's bad news for everyone. Eleanor studied him carefully. What was the last thing Calloway said to you before your conviction? Thomas's jaw tightened. He glanced away for a moment, lost in old memories. Then quietly he said, He told me I was a loose end. Daniel frowned. A loose end? Thomas nodded. He didn't just want me convicted. He wanted me erased. He told me the world would forget my name. Eleanor's fingers tapped against the table thoughtfully. Calloway had always been calculated. He didn't make reckless moves. Everything was precise, intentional. If he had returned now, after all these years, it meant something had changed. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to finish something. Eleanor took a deep breath. Thomas, if I find a way to prove your innocence. Thomas let out a dry laugh. Don't bother, Lawson. No one cares about an old case. Eleanor's expression didn't change. I care. Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then finally he sighed, leaning closer to the glass. There's one thing you need to know. Eleanor and Daniel leaned in. Calloway wasn't working alone back then, Thomas said quietly. There were people in high places protecting him. Daniel's brow furrowed. Who? Thomas shook his head. I don't know all their names, but I do know one thing. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. They never left. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Daniel swallowed. You're saying there are still people in power covering for him? Thomas nodded. And if Calloway's back, it means they want him back. The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about an old enemy resurfacing. This was bigger. Eleanor exhaled, setting down the phone. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas gave her a tired look. Don't thank me. Just finish what you started. Eleanor stood. Daniel hesitated before following her. As they walked toward the exit, Daniel turned to her. Miss Lawson, what do we do now? Eleanor's expression was unreadable. Then quietly she said, We find the people pulling Calloway's strings. She stepped through the doors, her mind racing. Calloway was dangerous, but the ones hiding in the shadows, the ones who had kept him protected all these years, they were worse. And now she was going to expose them no matter what it took. The cold night air clung to Eleanor as she and Daniel exited Rikers Island. The weight of Thomas Green's words sat heavy between them. They never left. The idea that Calloway had been part of something bigger, that powerful people had kept him hidden all these years, sent a sharp pulse of unease through Eleanor's chest. Daniel broke the silence first. "Miss Lawson, if what Green said is true, we're not just dealing with Calloway anymore. We're dealing with everyone who protected him." Eleanor nodded, her expression hard. "That's exactly right." Daniel swallowed. "So where do we even start? How do you track down people who've stayed hidden for 30 years? Eleanor's answer was immediate. "We follow the money." Daniel blinked. "Money?" Eleanor turned to him. "Corrupt men don't disappear, Daniel. They shift, they change positions, but one thing always remains the same. They protect their wealth." Daniel frowned. "Okay. But Calloway lost everything when he was disbarred. He doesn't have money anymore, right?" Eleanor gave him a knowing look. "Do you really believe that?" Daniel hesitated. Calloway had been one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state. A man like him didn't just walk away with nothing. Daniel sighed. "All right. So how do we track his money?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "We talk to someone who knows how to find it." Midnight, Lower Manhattan. A dimly lit warehouse stood at the end of a deserted alley, its rusted metal door barely holding onto its hinges. Daniel looked around, clearly nervous. "Miss Lawson, are you sure this is a good idea?" Eleanor stepped up to the door and knocked 3 times in a precise rhythm. "Not particularly." Daniel groaned. "Great. That makes me feel so much better." After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a lean, sharp-eyed man in his late 40s. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, and he wore a leather jacket that looked older than Daniel. The man's gaze flickered to Eleanor, and a slow smirk spread across his face. Well, if it isn't Eleanor Lawson." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Hello, Vincent." Vincent let out a low chuckle. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." His eyes drifted to Daniel. "And who's the kid?" Daniel bristled. "I'm not a kid." Eleanor sighed. "Vincent, we don't have time for small talk. We need your help." Vincent leaned against the door frame. "My help? I don't do charity work, Lawson." Eleanor met his gaze evenly. "This isn't charity. It's business." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Eleanor took a step closer. "We need to track down Calloway's money." Vincent's smirk disappeared instantly. He straightened, his face suddenly serious. "Calloway?" His voice dropped lower. "You're telling me James Calloway is back?" Eleanor nodded once. Vincent let out a low whistle. "Well, damn." Daniel frowned. "So you know he had money stashed away?" Vincent snorted. "Of course he did. You think a guy like that wouldn't have backup funds? Please. I always suspected he had offshore accounts." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "Can you find them?" Vincent hesitated. "Maybe, but it won't be easy. Calloway's people are careful. If he's back, then whoever's backing him has already moved the money." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "So what do we do?" Vincent sighed, rubbing his jaw. "There's one way. A dangerous way." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Vincent hesitated, then finally said, "We find Calloway's old banker." Daniel frowned. "Wait, he had a personal banker?" Vincent nodded. "Of course he did. Every corrupt politician and criminal does. And if Calloway still has access to his money, there's only one guy who could have handled it. David Langley." Eleanor's expression turned cold. Daniel looked between them. "Wait, who's David Langley?" Vincent exhaled. Langley used to be one of the biggest financial fixers in New York. If Calloway needed to launder money, hide assets, or move funds under the radar, Langley was the guy who made it happen. Daniel frowned. So where do we find him? Vincent smirked. That's the fun part. Eleanor crossed her arms. Vincent chuckled. Relax, Lawson. I know where he is. Eleanor's voice was firm. Then tell me. Vincent leaned in slightly, his smirk fading. Langley's not in some fancy office anymore, Eleanor. After Calloway fell, Langley disappeared. The only reason I know where he is, he chuckled, is because he owes me a favor. Daniel shifted nervously. And where is he now? Vincent's smirk returned. The only place a disgraced banker goes when he's got nowhere left to run. Eleanor sighed. Let me guess. Vincent's grin widened. Atlantic City. Daniel groaned. Oh great. This just keeps getting better. Eleanor turned to Vincent. We leave in the morning. Vincent held up his hands. Hey, I'm not the one going after a ghost, Lawson. But if you want to find Calloway's money, Langley is the key. Eleanor nodded. Then we have work to do. Vincent smirked. Hope you packed a bulletproof vest. The next morning, en route to Atlantic City, the drive was quiet save for the occasional sound of Daniel fidgeting with his seatbelt. Eleanor's mind was focused. Calloway's return had set a chain of events in motion. If he had resurfaced, it meant his people, the same ones who had protected him for years, were still watching, still waiting. And if Calloway was moving money again, then someone had given him permission. Daniel let out a long breath. Miss Lawson, what happens if we actually find this money? Eleanor's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then we'll know exactly who's backing him. Daniel hesitated. And then, Eleanor's eyes darkened. Then we bring them down. The car sped down the highway toward the neon glow of Atlantic City. Calloway had come back to reclaim his power, but Eleanor was about to remind him why he lost it in the first place. The neon lights of Atlantic City glowed like artificial stars against the early evening sky. The air smelled of salt and cigarette smoke, a mix of desperation and indulgence woven into every corner of the city. Eleanor parked the car in a dark alley near the boardwalk. Glancing at Daniel and Vincent, we go in, we find Langley, we get the information we need, and we leave. No unnecessary risks. Vincent chuckled. You say that like anything about this isn't a risk. Eleanor shot him a sharp look. Just lead us to him. Vincent smirked but nodded, stepping out of the car. Daniel adjusted his jacket nervously. I don't like this. If Langley's still alive, it means Calloway's people let him stay alive. That means they're watching him. Eleanor shut the car door and exhaled. I know. She knew this wasn't just about tracking Calloway's money anymore. This was about exposing the people behind him, the ones who had kept him protected, hidden, and funded for years. They stepped onto the boardwalk, past the flashing casinos and the crowds of tourists throwing their money away at the tables. Vincent led them into a quieter part of town, stopping outside a rundown bar with a flickering red sign. Langley's last known location. Vincent turned to Eleanor. He'll be in the back. He doesn't like visitors, so don't expect a warm welcome. Eleanor pushed open the door without hesitation. Inside, the bar smelled of stale beer and regret. A few men sat hunched over their drinks, uninterested in anything beyond their own misfortunes. At the far end of the room, a man in a wrinkled suit sat alone, swirling a glass of whiskey. His hair had thinned, and his once expensive clothes now looked cheap, but Eleanor recognized him instantly. David Langley. She walked toward him, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. Langley barely glanced up. Whatever you want. I don't have it. Eleanor leaned forward. I think you do. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a brief moment, there was something like recognition, then realization. Lawson. His voice was hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Neither should you." Langley exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't get it. If Calloway knows you're looking for me, you're already dead." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "We need to know where his money is." Langley let out a dry laugh. "You think I have access to that?" He shook his head. "I was cut off years ago." Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. "But you still know where it was." Langley hesitated. Eleanor leaned in slightly. "You don't have much time, Langley. If Calloway's back, he's not leaving loose ends. And right now, you're one of them." Langley's hands trembled slightly as he took another sip of his drink. "I don't have records, I don't have accounts, but—" He swallowed hard. "I know where the last of his money was hidden." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "Where?" Langley exhaled, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, in a hushed voice, he muttered, "The Haven Trust." Daniel frowned. "Never heard of it." Langley let out another bitter chuckle. "That's because it doesn't exist. Not on paper, anyway." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "It's a shadow bank run by Calloway's real allies. The ones who put him in power. The ones who want him back." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Who runs it?" Langley hesitated again. Then finally he whispered a name. Eleanor's entire body went cold. Daniel looked between them. "Who? Who is it?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Senator Richard Hale." Daniel's mouth fell open. "The Senator Richard Hale?" Langley nodded, his face tight with fear. "Hale has been pulling the strings for years. Calloway was just a pawn, and if Hale's bringing him back—" He swallowed. "It means he's planning something big." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Where's the bank located?" Langley's hands shook slightly as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, sliding it across the table. Eleanor unfolded it. An address was scrawled in ink. Daniel leaned over. That's right here in Atlantic City." Langley's voice dropped to a whisper. "If you go there, you won't come back." Eleanor folded the paper and stood. "We'll see about that." She turned to leave, but Langley grabbed her wrist, his eyes desperate. "If you take him down, Lawson, make sure he stays down this time." Eleanor nodded. "I intend to." Midnight, the Haven Trust. The building was unmarked, just a sleek glass structure on the waterfront, blending into the city like it had always belonged there. But Eleanor knew better. Vincent parked a block away, glancing in the rearview mirror. "This is a bad idea." Eleanor stepped out, probably. Daniel followed, his heart pounding. "Miss Lawson, this is suicide." Eleanor exhaled. "If we don't do this, Calloway wins." She walked toward the building, the night swallowing her figure. Inside the lobby was quiet, too quiet. A single receptionist sat behind a marble desk, but Eleanor knew she wasn't just a receptionist. She stepped forward. "I have an appointment." The woman looked up, unfazed. "Name?" Eleanor smiled coldly. "Eleanor Lawson." The receptionist barely reacted. Instead, she picked up the phone and murmured something. Then she looked at Eleanor. "Go on up. He's expecting you." Daniel tensed. Eleanor's jaw tightened. James Calloway was waiting. She stepped into the elevator, Daniel by her side. As the doors closed, a sense of finality settled over them. This was it. One way or another, it ended tonight. The office, top floor. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a massive office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And standing in the center of the room, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, was James Calloway. His smirk was slow, confident. "Eleanor," Calloway greeted. Eleanor didn't blink. "Calloway." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "You've been busy." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. So have you? Calloway chuckled. You know, when I heard you were back in the game, I wasn't sure if I should be impressed or disappointed. Eleanor smiled coldly. Funny? I was thinking the same thing about you. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. You should have stayed gone, Lawson. Eleanor's voice was like steel. So should you? Silence stretched between them. Then Calloway smirked. Well, he said, let's see who wins this time. The city lights gleamed outside, and the war began. The sun was rising over New York City, casting golden light across the skyline. The battle was over. James Calloway had been taken down again. Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps, watching as news crews swarmed outside. The headlines were already spreading. Disgraced former DA James Calloway arrested in major corruption scandal. Senator Richard Hale under federal investigation for money laundering and criminal conspiracy. The web of corruption had been untangled, and the men who had controlled the city from the shadows were finally being exposed. Daniel stood beside her, his face still pale from the events of the night before. I still can't believe we actually did it, Eleanor exhaled, adjusting her coat. It's not over yet. Daniel frowned, but Calloway's done, Hale's finished. What else is left? Eleanor glanced at him. Justice doesn't stop at an arrest. Daniel, it's a fight you keep showing up for every day. Daniel studied her for a long moment. And you're going to keep fighting, aren't you? Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. I never really stopped. The city stretched before her, vast and unpredictable. She had walked away once, but now she knew this was where she belonged. Not in retirement, not in hiding, but right here in the fight. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. Then, with quiet certainty, she turned to Daniel and